Hey guys, I wanted to talk a little bit about the third house in astrology because I've been studying about this and I'm really inspired by it. Um, it is not considered a great house in terms of how we rank houses astrologically, um, but I think there are some important themes that we don't always talk about that um, I really resonate with and I feel like are really important. So I am a person with a loaded third house. I have by whole sign, a Taurus stellium in my third house. My Sun, my Venus, my Mars, my Mercury, all in the third house. And in modern astrology, we associate the third house with Mercury, but in ancient astrology, it is the third house is the joy of the moon. And actually, the association with siblings that we get from the third house arises from the fact that the ninth house is the house of the sun, and the third house, and the sun, or the god, is known as the house of God, the ninth house, whereas the third house is the house of the moon and the house of goddess. And so actually I want to read for you the little passage that Demetra George starts with in her ancient astrology book where she's talking about the houses. So this is a quote or a section from Manilius, who was an astrologer in the 1st century CE. So this is what he says about the third house of goddess. Shining face to face with it, meaning the ninth house, is that part of the heaven which rises first from the bottommost regions and brings back the sky once more. It controls the fortunes and fates of brothers, and it acknowledges the moon as its mistress, who beholds her brother's realms shining on her from the other side of heaven, and who reflects human mortality in the dying edges of her face. Goddess, Dea, is the name in Roman speech to be given to this region, while the Greeks called her by the word in their language, Thea, goddess. I really love that passage from Manilius, talking about the sun and the moon as sister and brother and ruling these complementary ninth and third houses. And the power of this third house to regenerate. Brings back the sky once more. Rises first from the bottommost regions and brings back the sky once more. One of the things that I think is really not acknowledged or talked about in terms of the third house is its sacred significance. So the third house is not considered to be a super strong house. It's not angular, it's cadent. And it's not as unfavorable as some of the other houses, but it's kind of like generally seen as a meh kind of house. I think in the rankings, Demetra ranks it kind of 9th out of 12th in terms of the esteem that is generally accorded. But the power of the third house comes, I think, not from its worldly power, but from its spiritual power and local kind of situation where it's connected to the environment. And I want to read a little bit to you about the spiritual side of the third house because, again, I think people are not really aware of this. So Demetra says, the spiritual side of the third house has for the most part been lost in the process of transmission. By reflection, the spiritual and religious topics that are found in the ninth house shine down into the third house, giving the significations of religious observances, sacred rites, and divination. So the ninth house is not the only house a sacred activity. The house of the god is not the only place where the sacred is happening. In fact, the house of the god would be more associated with temples that you would travel to, whereas the local observances and rites would be seen in the third house. And another quote, Valens tells us that in the third house, some receive revelations from a god, prognosticate the future, prepare sacrifices, or make prayers and votive offerings. So the Caden houses are thought to be some of the reason that they're not always seen to be strong is because they are metacosmios. They're the interspace between worlds, and it is when we're more grounded in the world, as with the cardinal points and houses, the angles, that we're more likely to manifest outwardly, right? But these spaces between the worlds have, I think, their own power, and part of that power can be receiving something, as with a revelation from the gods. It is known as a house of divination in ancient texts. Also, interestingly, even though it's the joy of the moon, there is association when Mercury is in the third house. According to Firmicus Maternus from the 4th century, he said that Mercury in the third house indicates priests, mages, chief physicians, mathematicians, astrologers, and those who learn from their own efforts whatever was not handed down from the traditions of others. So, Demetrius says, this view of the third house can be interpreted as an alternate state of consciousness, where one can access one's own inner faculty of intuition, which is historically connected to divine inspiration. Love that. As opposed to spiritual knowledge gained from an external authority. So, I just wanted to briefly share about the third house, particularly in terms of some of its spiritual significations, since I don't see it talked about that often, and also plant this idea of the Caden houses as being these houses of being between the worlds and potentially, especially with the 3rd and the 9th, receiving spiritual revelation. But I think the 3rd house is special. It might not be the most powerful, but I love the fact that I have 4 planets in the house of the goddess. More soon. Hope you guys are having a lovely day.